Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Friess, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'll continue now backing up a paragraph from where we left, or a part of a paragraph from where we left off yesterday on the program. Beginning in the top of the page 438, if you're following along in your own copy of the book. Speaking of Pope Leo XIII's attempt to restore the temporal power, the kingly power of the papacy to his own head, it says, if he were not influenced to do this by his desire to regain the temporal power which was taken away from his predecessor, Pope Pius IX, his education and training by the Jesuits would impress his mind with the conviction that a temporal crown upon his head is a positive necessity in order that he may promote, quote unquote, the greater glory of God. So it is a tenet of the papacy that he cannot effectively, quote, promote the greater glory of God without that temporal crown upon his head, without the ability to dictate to the kings and the governments of the earth what they will do. Let me just put it this way. He cannot promote the greater glory of God unless he has the power to burn heretics, unless he has the power to exterminate those who oppose his pretended power. And that's why the Pope needs the temporal crown on his head. Because without it, he cannot deceive the whole world. He cannot lead the kings of the earth. He cannot lead us all into perdition. He cannot enslave the people without the temporal power to enforce that enslavement. Without the temporal power, the Pope is powerless. He can't promote his spiritual power or any other power unless he has the power to persecute, the power to tax, the power to coerce, the power to imprison, and the power to kill. And it says, consequently, when it is thus made too plain and palpable to admit of fair denial that the infallibility of the Pope is the chiefest and the most fundamental dogma of the faith, the foundation of the whole system of papal belief, it is positively obligatory upon us in this country to understand its full import and meaning. If anything were required to make this obligation more binding than it is found in the very facts now confronting us that our public schools are pronounced godless because this religious dogma, the infallibility of the Pope and the temporal power of the Pope, is not taught to our children, and that it is taught to Roman Catholic children in parochial schools, mainly under Jesuit control. Now, taking this statement, that what is proof that the temporal power of the Pope is the chiefest and most fundamental dogma of the Roman Catholic faith is demonstrated by the fact that they call our schools godless, because they don't promote the temporal power of the Pope, nor the infallibility of the Pope. Only the parochial schools do. And that through Jesuit control. Now stop and think with me. If the Vatican, seeing these public schools as godless because they don't promote the temporal power of the Pope or the spiritual power of the Pope or his infallibility, and the parochial schools do under Jesuit control, what do you think the papacy would design to do to correct that quote-unquote error? Well, he would put the Jesuits in control of the public schools too, wouldn't he? And that's what they've done. They've put the Jesuits in control not just of the Roman Catholic parochial schools that teach the temporal power of the Pope, that teach the divine right of the Pope to rule the world, that teach that he is the vicar and the replacement of the Son of God on earth, and that teach that he is infallible and, as it were, God on earth. But they're going to do that in the public schools. Now, if the public schools, as they are occupied by Protestants, they got to be very careful what language they use. So they teach circumspectly. And what they have taught in the public schools is globalism. Okay? What the Jesuits tactfully and carefully taught in the public schools through our public education system, having gotten control of our public education system, rather than coming out directly and promoting the Pope's temporal power, his infallibility, his divine right to rule the world, they're simply preparing the common schools for a global monarchy in preparation for the full pronunciation of the Pope's infallibility and his divine right to rule. They put the Jesuits in control of the education system of this country, not just the parochial schools, but all of the schools. And this is the hazard that we have suffered because we did not take the advice of R.W. Thompson and so many other writers of this period of time in ousting the Jesuits from our country. If the Jesuits are not opposed, they are free to do as they please. And because of the indifference of Protestantism, having lost its Protestant heritage, having lost its Protestant knowledge and wisdom, and have become ecumenical and careful now to join forces with the Roman Catholic Church, the Jesuits are virtually freed to write our textbooks in the schools, or to sit on committees and boards to make sure that certain information, certain textbooks, Protestant textbooks, never are allowed on the shelves of the libraries in the schools. R.W. Thompson saw all of this way back in the late 1870s, and he wrote about it, this book. We're seeing the culmination of the apathy and the indifference of Protestantism in this country. Our public schools are now preparing our children, our Protestant children, to accept a global monarch. And history shows us who that global monarch will be. The papacy. Now, continuing where we left off yesterday. Tedious as the evidence already adduced may seem to be to those who look at such matters as these only by casual glances, it is indispensable to a thorough knowledge of the truth that the religio-political matters which this decree has brought within the jurisdiction of the Pope should be plainly and distinctly made known. Okay? This is no time for people who just look superficially at this matter. This is a time for people who are willing to dig deep. R.W. Thompson says, tedious as the evidence already adduced may seem to be to those who look at such matters as these only by casual glances. In other words, Rome has a built-in protection that it takes more than just a superficial glance at this evidence to come to any real conclusions. It's going to take tedious effort on the part of Americans to fully see this. Now, I've expended 10 years or more of tedious day and night research into this matter, and I can understand exactly what R.W. Thompson is saying. Inquisition Update now going on 6 years or more, reading these books on the air so everybody can avail themselves of the wisdom that is expressed by these authors, can only come to one conclusion. It takes a great deal of research to understand what is really happening in this country. Tedious and time-consuming, thought-provoking. It's nothing that you can do like just skimming a book or skimming a newspaper. It takes serious effort. And R.W. Thompson knows that unless one has a special drive and a motivation, one is not going to look but superficially at this matter. So I'm simply giving you the experience of all my tedious work and the conclusions that I've come to based on that work. And they are the same as R.W. Thompson's. Tedious as the evidence already adduced may seem to be to those who look at such matters as these only by casual glances, it is indispensable to a thorough knowledge of the truth that the political religious matters which this decree has brought within the jurisdiction of the Pope should be plainly and distinctly made known. You have to work tediously, sorting through all of history and the scriptures, and to make the correct assessment after having accomplished all of that work, and then make it known everywhere. That's what Inquisition Update does. Now it says, without this knowledge, our tolerance may seem to invite dangerous encroachments. In other words, if we do not do this diligent, tedious task of examining the teachings and the history of the Jesuits and the papacy, like those of Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII, if we do not expend the energy, and if we do not come to the correct conclusion after doing all that investigation, and if we do not make it known far and wide what the portent is for this country, it will be seen by our enemies, the Jesuits and the papacy, that they are free to further encroach upon our rights. He says, without this knowledge, our tolerance may seem to invite dangerous encroachments by the Jesuits and those obedient to them upon some of the most highly cherished principles of our government. R.W. Thompson says our government stands to fall if people don't do this tedious work, make the right conclusions, and then inform the rest of the American people. It will be seen as tolerant and indifference. It will be seen as tolerance and indifference to the papacy, and they are free to continue the advancement of their New World Order and the overthrow of our government. He says, we have seen from one papal author what is meant at Rome by a religious education, and shall in the next chapter see cumulative proof from another, probably even more influential. From this latter author, even more distinctly than from the former, we shall see how absolutely we should be subject to the commands of the Pope, how we should be domineered over by his ecclesiastical hierarchy and their Jesuit allies, how all of our actions, our thoughts and impulses would be held in obedience to ecclesiastical, that is, Roman Catholic priestly and monarchical dictation, and how we should have, instead of a government of, by, and for the people, one under the arbitrary dictatorship of a foreign sovereign who can neither speak our language nor understand our Constitution and laws. He's speaking specifically of the papacy, the God of this world. Now, he says we might be permitted to manage our secular affairs, according to the Pope, such as relate to the transaction of our ordinary business, but in everything we should consider as pertaining to the church or himself. But in everything that we should consider as pertaining to the church or himself, he, the Pope, would become our absolute and irresponsible ruler. And let me clarify, the word irresponsible here is made reference to the fact that the Pope will not be held answerable to anyone. As King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the God of this world, the replacement of Christ on earth with complete sovereign power over every man, woman, and child and government of the world, no one may hold him to account. This is what he means by describing him as an absolute and irresponsible ruler. Now, church and state would be united, and all the measures provided by the framers of our government for protection of our natural rights, such as freedom of religious belief, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech, would be destroyed. Free government would be at an end, and a threatening cloud would hover over us like a pall of death. We should be turned back to the Middle Ages, and all the fruits of the Protestant Reformation would be lost, without the probability of ever being afterwards regained by our posterity. Let me just tell you, the Pope ever gains the means of doing so, he will make sure that Protestantism is never a threat again in the world. That the Bible that brought on Protestantism, the truth of Almighty God in His Word, will never be able to raise up another Protestant Reformation. The Bible is going to be destroyed either by burning or by so vastly corrupting it that no Protestant Reformation could result from it. And we're already seeing both taking place. Now, he says that we should be turned, if the Pope has his way, we should be turned back to the Middle Ages, and all the fruits of the Protestant Reformation would be lost, without the probability of ever being afterwards regained by our posterity, by our children. A careful scanning of what follows will show that this picture is not overdrawn. And if it is not overdrawn, the obligation to see that these calamities shall not befall us rests heavily upon the Roman Catholic as it does upon the Protestant part of our population. Interesting, isn't it? R.W. Thompson includes Roman Catholics. This is important to Roman Catholics in this country. Why? Because they love their Protestant liberties as much as we do. And that if they ever were made privy to the real design and the real nature of their papacy and of their Jesuit priests and their attempt to elevate the papacy to global monarchical dictatorial power in the world, they would resist that power with everything in their strength, just as did France, just as did Italy, and all the other Roman Catholics of Europe after the Protestant Reformation. They won't like papal tyranny once it is fully established in this country. They won't like it any better than the Protestants will. History makes that a virtual certainty. So this includes Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics who are offended by Inquisition update make a grievous error by turning it out. They should listen and understand that their papacy and their Jesuits are threatening their very liberties, the same liberties that are loved and cherished by Protestants in this country. He says, and if it is not, the obligation to see that these calamities shall not befall us rests as heavily upon the Roman Catholic as it does upon the Protestant part of our population. A common spirit should animate the hearts of all, no matter what their religious belief, and stimulate them to joint protest and mutual defense. Those who brave the dangers of navigation upon the same vessel at sea must, when the storm rages, unite together in heart and hand, or run the risk of sinking in a watery grave. There's no time for religious infighting. The ship of state is about to sink. The storm from the papacy and the Jesuits is raging. It's time for Catholics and Protestants together to renounce the temporal and the spiritual power of the Pope and calm the seas. What R.W. Thompson is suggesting is we need another Protestant Reformation, remembering that those who led the Protestant Reformation were formerly Roman Catholics, who, after reading the Bible for themselves, came to the unanimous conclusion that the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church was that which was described in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, the whore that rides the beast, the scarlet harlot of the Tiber. And that's what led the Protestant Reformation. If the Catholics in this country did as did the Catholics of Europe at the time of Martin Luther, we could liberate this country of papal tyranny. That's the kind of ecumenism I could vote for, provided that these Roman Catholics give up on their Roman Catholic faith and return to the Scriptures. Put away all their human traditions. Put away all their paganism. Put away all their idolatry. Throw out the trash with the Pope and his Jesuits and become truly Protestant. Become members of the body of Christ and become sovereigns in his kingdom. That's the only way we'll guarantee ourselves that they will not return to their vomit. He says, those who brave the dangers of navigation upon the same vessel at sea must, when the storm rages, unite together in heart and hand, or run the risk of sinking in a watery grave. So it is with those whose lives and fortunes and earthly interests are under the protection of the same civil institutions, the government of the United States. If they become divided into angry and adverse factions under the dominion of unrestrained passions, they invite the spoiler to undermine the foundations of the fortress which shelters and protects us all. That's the kind of unity there needs to be. Unity in Christ, unity in the Scriptures, and unity against Antichrist. We've come upon the break. We'll return right after these messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
$100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. And if you would like to support Inquisition Update, please make a contribution to First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Nicholas pays the bills. Nicholas pays for the airtime. And Nicholas needs your support. Support First Amendment Radio. Now, speaking of this spoiler that threatens the very foundations of our fortress, our faith, our Protestant faith, and the government of the United States that allows us to have religious liberty, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, R.W. Thompson, continues to talk about this spoiler. He says that the Jesuits, in the war that they are now making and have always made against civil and religious liberty, constitute such a spoiler. History attests in numerous volumes. If we want to know who the spoilers are that threaten the very foundations of our Protestant faith and of the government that allows us to worship God according to the dictates of our conscience, that gives us the right to criticize both the Pope and the King, either by speech or by letter, is the Jesuits. And the only way to know who this spoiler is to research their history, which is the very purpose of Inquisition Update, to show the history of the papacy and the Jesuits, who together are trying to overthrow all liberty in this country and subject us all to Roman Catholic canon law and papal tyranny and Jesuit dictation, to make us all automatons. In other words, to make us all mindless slaves that just simply obey every command of the papacy, that think not for ourselves, that are convinced that as a matter of religious faith, of salvation, we must not argue with either the Pope or the King, but must simply, without question, obey their every commands. All we have to do is search history. History attests in numerous volumes who these spoilers are. Now he says, wheresoever civil government has been made obedient to the popular will, that is, the will of the people, not the Pope, the will of the people, they, the Jesuits, have labored indefatigably for its overthrow. That's what history reveals. Wherever governments have risen of, by, and for the people, the Jesuits work day and night tirelessly with superhuman, and I will say with Satan's leading and help, to overthrow these governments. And it says, to that end, monarchism has been made the central and controlling principle of their organization. So completely so that their society never has existed and could not exist without it. You see, the Jesuit order is a monarchy. The Jesuit general is the brain trust of the Jesuits, and the Jesuits are not allowed to think for themselves or to do anything of their own, but simply march at the drumbeat of the Jesuit general. They are to be an extension of the mind of the general, an extension of the hand and the foot of the general. And their intent is to reduce the world to the same unthinking, unmasculine, cadaver-like obedience. And without this monarchical system, the Jesuit order would cease to exist. It could not function. The Jesuit general might express it this way: if there are too many chiefs and not enough Indians, all you have is chaos. Chaos does not describe the Jesuit order. Whatever chaos they create is created for a purpose, and that is to overthrow the governments of the world, and to do it under the cloak of chaos. 9/11 would be legitimately described as chaos. It was perpetrated on 9/11 in order to cloak or to justify the overthrow of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. And that was done through the instrument of the Patriot Act and other presidential directives and other legislation that, if the Founding Fathers, as they are so called, would be privy to, they would turn in their graves. The Protestants of the colonies at the beginning of the foundation of this country would turn in their graves. That's how they're overthrowing. They use chaos as cover for overthrowing our government, overthrowing our institutions, overthrowing Protestantism. The Jesuits warred malevolently upon the best of the popes and defied the authority of the Roman Catholic Church for more than 100 years, never abating their vengeance, except when the pontifical chair was occupied by a pope who submitted to their dictation. Even the papacy itself describes the Jesuit order as those who row the bark of the papacy. If the papal boat moves, it moves because the Jesuits are rowing it. And yet at the same time, these Jesuits know that that boat won't move unless they do row it, and they are bound and determined to control that papacy so that the boat goes where the Jesuits want it to go and not where the papacy wants it to go. They control the papacy. They are the drivers of monarchism around the world, as we saw in the example of Italy. It was the Jesuits who fomented the unholy alliance between the monarchs of Europe, who had lost their political power because of the Protestant Reformation. They were the ones who united the Pope and these monarchs together to reestablish monarchical rule in the world and to extend it where it had never existed before. He says they are today, as at every hour since the time of Ignatius Loyola, compactly united to destroy as sinful and heretical all civil institutions constructed by the people for their own protection, and substitute for them such as are obedient to monarchs and their own interpretation of the divine law. And now, when the pontifical authority is vested in a pope whose youthful mind was impressed and disciplined by Jesuit teachings, that's Leo XIII, and they stand ready to subvert every government which has separated the state from the church and secured the freedom of conscience and of speech and of the press, and are straining every nerve to obtain the control of our system of common school education so as to instill their doctrines, Jesuit doctrines, into the minds of the American youth. The times have become such that all the citizens of the United States, Roman Catholic and Protestant, irrespective of their forms of religious belief, should form a solid and united body in resistance to the Jesuits' un-American plottings. Now, anyone who is taking more than just a casual observation of this book, those who are carefully listening to this book, are coming to some pretty real and startling conclusions. That the United States of America has failed miserably in not following the example of all the other nations in the world, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, in that they have never kicked the Jesuits out of this country. Their un-American plottings go unrestrained. No protest from the Protestants. And Catholics are led to believe that the Jesuits are the most holy of the holy Roman Catholic Church. They literally come and go as they please in this country. United States of America has become an operation, a base of operations for the Jesuits throughout the world. And the result of that is most evident. The most evident occurrence of that fact is that the United States military is used all over the world to advance the papal bark. The United States. See, the Jesuits have co-opted our government and co-opted our military and put the United States military at the oars that row the papal bark. The Jesuits are the one who beat the drums to keep the rowers in rhythm and direct their course. But it's the United States military, the United States government, the United States State Department that rows the oars of the papal bark. And that the American people are ignorant of this is mind-boggling. And it's only because they've erased this history from the schools. Instead of teaching Protestantism, they teach monarchism. And monarchism is just another name for the papacy. Now, R.W. Thompson's going to change directions a little bit. And it's going to take a little time and effort to sort all this out, but he's going to make mention of Charles Carroll. You've heard him talked about here on Inquisition Update before, and R.W. Thompson has missed a few critical elements in his discussion about Charles Carroll, and I'll try to fill them in as we go. Remember, Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the leader, the Roman Catholic leader of the Roman Catholic colony called Maryland during the colonial period. Charles Carroll knew that if Roman Catholicism was going to survive in this country, it had to at least temporarily acquiesce to this demand for religious liberty in the country. That if it was going to survive in a set of colonies, 12 of which were devoutly Protestant, and that the Maryland colony was the only Roman Catholic colony in the fledgling nation, they had to be very careful and bide their time until Roman Catholicism could grow in strength and eventually overthrow the government and make America Catholic. The concessions that were made by Charles Carroll and the Catholics of Maryland was an exercise of expedience, of necessity. And we are to give no undue credit to Charles Carroll for declaring religious liberty a tenet of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. A thorough investigation of the colonial period would show that the Revolutionary War that separated us from Protestant control in England and this demand for religious liberty by the Roman Catholics of Maryland was simply a way to give religious rights to Roman Catholics where they had been denied in England. And we're suffering the consequences now of that religious liberty of Roman Catholics. Now, he says, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who signed our Declaration of Independence, was a Roman Catholic, but not a Jesuit, he says. Now, I'll just tell you, his near kin was a Jesuit priest, John Carroll, the founder of Jesuit Georgetown University. To say that Charles Carroll was not a Jesuit is absurd on its face. Charles Carroll and Daniel Carroll and all the Carroll boys were educated in the Jesuit University in France. They were Jesuitized. They knew Rome's plan for this, the long-term plan of the Vatican for this country. This is where R.W. Thompson makes a grievous error. He did not thoroughly research Charles Carroll and the Jesuit connection to his family. He says, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who signed our Declaration of Independence, was a Roman Catholic, but not a Jesuit. He loved his country, he loved his church and adhered to its faith. Someday I'll learn to read. I apologize to my listeners. He loved his church and adhered to its faith, which did not then require him to believe that its pope was infallible. Now let me stop you right there, Mr. Thompson. While it was not an official dogma of the church, papal infallibility was wrestled with throughout the Roman Catholic Church history. There were many Roman Catholics in all generations throughout the last 1,500 years that naturally asserted that if the Pope is indeed the replacement of Christ on earth, that he must be infallible, that if he is really the literal voice of Jesus Christ on earth, he must be obeyed implicitly as though he were Christ on earth. We're making now too much of the decree of Vatican Council I in 1870 that the Pope automatically, all of a sudden, became infallible. He was always regarded as infallible by his devout followers. It were only some of the councils of the Roman Catholic Church, some of the ecumenical councils, were doubtful about the papacy's infallibility. So the church has always been divided upon that issue, some siding with the papacy, some siding with the councils, and some choosing not to get involved. But to say that Charles Carroll was not required to believe that the Pope was infallible is not correct. And that he did acknowledge the papacy as infallible in practice is the very reason why Charles Carroll was allowed to become so instrumental in the management of the Maryland colony and in the Declaration of Independence and in the Revolutionary War. You think Rome would have allowed somebody to hold those positions and those powers without acquiescing to the infallibility of the Pope? I think we give R.W. Thompson a little bit too much credit once in a while. He says of Charles Carroll that he loved his church and adhered to its faith, which did not then require him to believe that its pope was infallible. And with his mind filled with patriotic emotions, he stood by the side of Thomas Jefferson, a deist, I will add, Benjamin Franklin, a Satanist, I will add, and 54 other patriots, all of whom were Freemasons and occult members of secret societies, as history clearly indicates, and united with them in separating church and state, in establishing a government of the people, in guaranteeing the absolute freedom of religious belief. And when he and they looked upon the great work they had accomplished, they solemnly declared that it was in obedience to, quote, the laws of nature and the nature's God, unquote. He who now insists, as the Jesuits do, that in all this he violated his Christian conscience by offending God in the perpetration of an act of heresy, not only asperses unjustly the memory of this unselfish patriot, but wounds the sensibilities of every true American heart. Now, R.W. Thompson still is not aware of the fact that the Revolutionary War was fomented by the Jesuits with the help of the Freemasons in the British Parliament. The whole object was to separate the colonies from Protestantism as it existed and controlled England at the time. That made the practice of Roman Catholicism illegal, and that kicked the Jesuits out of their country and would forbid them ever to return. And those who did, who were caught, were executed. They did not want that to be repeated here in the colonies. Rome had just as much interest in promoting a revolution in this country and religious liberty for Catholics as did Protestants, wish not to be overly taxed or overly imposed upon by the King of England. And they wanted their own government, and they, like the Roman Catholics, wanted religious liberty without fear of persecution from a Roman Catholic monarch. So all things worked together to separate the United States from Protestant Great Britain. Some wanted that separation on Protestant grounds. Rather, an overwhelming majority wanted that separation on Protestant grounds. And in the extreme minority was this Roman Catholic colony called Maryland, who wanted that separation for Roman Catholic causes. The Revolutionary War achieved religious liberty for Roman Catholics. And look where we're at today. And R.W. Thompson calls him an unselfish patriot. Charles Carroll knew of the eventual overthrow of our government, the government that he helped to create. Charles Carroll was privy to the Vatican's design for this country from the very beginning. I'm convinced of it. As we learned in the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. The Carroll family together all knew what the eventual destiny of the United States would be. The overthrow of this temporary government, which they had a huge hand in assembling for a papal monarchy, which we're seeing today. Knowing that the Catholics were vastly outnumbered, they couldn't impose the papacy on the rest of the colonies, so they had to separate themselves from the papacy on a temporary basis and beg the Pope to keep shut and don't try to manipulate things in the United States, or the Maryland colony would be exterminated by the Protestants. Jesuit John Carroll had to tactfully tell the Pope to butt out until the American Roman Catholic Church, under American Roman Catholic bishops, could again assert the papacy as their God. And the time of the Revolution was not the time to assert papal tyranny and papal power over these Protestants who had been persecuted by both the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic government of England during the reign of Bloody Mary. They were not prepared to allow any foreign influence, and especially not that of the papacy. This was all well understood by the Carroll family and by the Jesuits overall, and especially by the papacy. The American Roman Catholic Church had to come up under the influence and control of Protestantism. It had to survive. It had to bide its time. It had to be very careful about what it said. It could not wear its religion on its sleeve as it did in the Holy Roman Empire. They couldn't dictate. They had to make concessions. They had to survive. And that's what Charles Carroll was all about. That's what Daniel Carroll was all about. That's what Jesuit John Carroll was all about. And that's what Georgetown University was all about. I mean, ecumenism got its start right from the very foundation of this country. And all of it had a grand design. And that was the eventual overthrow of the Constitution that they helped to build. That Constitution preserved their lives against Protestant retribution. It was inevitable that if their plan succeeded, they, having so much to do with the foundation of our original government in this country, that they could claim it as theirs and they could claim their right to change it at will. And that's what we're seeing today. It's come full circle. They're going to change it now. They're going to elevate the papacy, and they're going to make us a monarchy, and they're going to do it through a constitutional convention. I'm convinced of it. We'll continue with R.W. Thompson's assessment of Charles Carroll next Monday on the program. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.